My name is Woody Harrelson. I'm 74 years old, and this is the story I've been carrying alone for 3 years now. I've never told it to anyone, not my therapist, not the few friends I had left before I stopped making the effort. But I think it's time. I still remember the exact moment I decided to do it. I was standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning looking at a photograph I hadn't looked at in almost a decade. It was from 1998, my wife Sarah, me, and our 2 kids, Michael and Jennifer, all smiling at some beach house we'd rented. We looked happy. Actually happy, not the kind of happiness you perform for cameras. I remember that trip. Michael was 8, Jennifer was 5, and I was young enough to still believe that moments like that one meant something permanent. That photograph was the last thing I kept from my old life. Everything else I'd gotten rid of over the years. The old house gone. The furniture Sarah had chosen, sold at an estate sale to strangers who didn't care what it meant. The boxes of photo albums and letters, I donated those to a local thrift store in 2019, some gesture toward letting go, I suppose. But I couldn't let go of that one photo. I kept it in a frame on my kitchen counter, moving it whenever I moved, which wasn't often anymore. I'd been living in the same 1-bedroom apartment in Portland for about 8 years by that point, subsisting on my pension and whatever work I could pick up doing odd jobs around the building. The morning with the photograph was the morning I realized I'd finally made it to the point where I had nothing left to lose. Let me back up a bit. You need to understand what my life had been before the apartment, before the small studio in Seattle, before I became the kind of man who had to move several times in a decade, trying to outrun the space between memory and reality. I worked as a civil engineer for 32 years. Good, steady work. I was competent, reliable, the kind of person you could depend on to be at the office at 7:45 a.m. on a Monday morning, coffee in hand, ready to review blueprints or manage a team. I made decent money. Not rich money, but enough to own a home in Portland, a house with 4 bedrooms and a yard where Michael and Jennifer could play. Sarah didn't need to work full-time. She volunteered at the school and organized charity events. We had a normal life. The kind of life that feels like it will just continue indefinitely because it's built on the routine of everyday normalcy. My son Michael took over my firm after I retired in 2005. Jennifer moved to Boston for graduate school and married a man named Thomas. They had 2 kids, Emma and Daniel. I was a grandfather, though I saw them rarely, which became rarer as the years went on. Sarah and I traveled a bit during our first few years of retirement. We did a cruise to Alaska, spent a month in Italy. We were the kind of retirement couple you see in those brochures. And then in 2009, Sarah had a stroke. It wasn't massive, but it changed her. Took away some of the sharpness, some of the quicksilver way she moved through the world. She recovered physically, but something had shifted. She became withdrawn, difficult. And I became the caregiver. This is where I need to tell you something difficult. I wasn't a good caregiver. I wasn't patient with her frustration. I resented the way our life had contracted into the space of a house that was suddenly too quiet, too small, too much like a waiting room. By 2011, we had barely spoken in complete sentences for months. We were just 2 people living parallel lives in the same space. Sarah died in 2012. A second stroke, this one massive. I remember finding her on the kitchen floor. I remember calling 911. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room, and I remember thinking clearly, without guilt, without pain. I remember thinking this is a relief. I didn't know that grief could come so late, that it could arrive months after the funeral, after the will had been read and the probate finished. But it did. It came in 2014, and it came hard, and by then it was too late to do anything with it except carry it. Michael was running the firm well. Jennifer called more after her mother died, but the conversations were careful, circling around nothing important. They both wanted me to sell the house. It was too big, they said. I couldn't manage it alone, they said. What they meant was, this big house makes you look sad and alone, and we don't want to think about that. What they really meant was, we're busy with our own lives. The house represented something to them, a burden I was carrying that was somehow related to them, some kind of obligation. I sold the house in 2015. I downsized to a condo, and then in 2017 I downsized again. Each move was another letting go, another smaller space, another version of myself that was slightly less than the previous one. I want to tell you about the man at the grocery store before I tell you about my children's betrayal, because the order matters. It was sometime in late 2019. I was at my regular grocery store on a Thursday morning. I went on Thursday mornings because it was less crowded than the weekends, and I had nowhere else to be. I was standing in the produce section, trying to figure out which apples looked the least sad when I dropped a bag of grapes. They scattered across the floor, that soft purple explosion. I was 71 then, my back was bad, and I stood there staring at them scattered across the linoleum floor, thinking about whether it was worth bending down to pick them up. A man came over. He was probably in his 50s, black, wearing work boots and a fleece jacket. He didn't ask if I needed help, which was the right thing. He just crouched down and started picking up grapes, the ones that had rolled under the refrigerated displays. I crouched down too, and we picked them up together in silence. It took maybe 2 minutes. He held the bag open, I handed him grapes, and when we were done, he closed the bag and handed it to me. "They're still good," he said. "Some of them just the floor ones." He smiled, and it wasn't pity. It was just a human being helping another human being the way it should be, the way it almost never is. "Thank you," I said, and he nodded and walked away. I didn't even remember his face clearly after he left. But I remember the feeling, that small moment of being acknowledged, of having my clumsiness treated as a normal thing that happens to people rather than as some kind of emblem of my failure. Michael called me in January 2020. He called to tell me that the firm was being acquired. He'd negotiated a deal that would make him wealthy, very wealthy. He didn't ask me how I was doing. He wanted me to know that I should be proud of him, that he'd built something from the foundation I'd given him. I congratulated him, I meant it, but I also felt it, the shift, the moment when I went from being his father, the person who had taught him, guided him, to being the person who'd existed once and could now be relegated to the past tense. "Your sister and I are planning a family trip," he said. "We want to celebrate, you should come." This was March 2020, before the world changed, before everyone locked themselves inside. He was calling to invite me to a family gathering, and I understood immediately that this was mercy. That he was doing the right thing because he'd been taught to, not because he wanted me there. "I'd like that," I said. He said they'd get back to me about the dates. They never did. The pandemic happened, and then it didn't happen all at once. It just became the new normal, the constant hum of isolation in the background. Michael sent me a check at Christmas that year. Jennifer sent an email wishing me well. I sent them both the same thing back. I didn't make plans to visit them, but in late November 2021, I decided I was going to anyway. I didn't tell them. I bought a plane ticket to Boston and I booked a hotel, and I told myself this was going to be different. This was going to be the time I showed up in their lives and they remembered why I mattered. I arrived on a Tuesday evening. Jennifer's house was a beautiful colonial in a neighborhood that cost more per block than I'd made in some years of my career. There were cars in the driveway, theirs, I assumed. The lights were on. I sat in the taxi for a moment, my suitcase heavy beside me, and then I paid the driver and rolled my bag up to the front door. I knocked rather than ringing the bell, I'm not sure why. Some hesitation maybe, some part of me already knowing. Michael opened the door. He was 59 years old but looked younger than me by decades, the kind of wealth where you can afford to look younger if you want to. He had a drink in his hand. There was music playing behind him, the sound of voices and laughter. "Dad," he said, and his face did that thing that happens when people see something they weren't expecting, that flash of surprise that can't quite be hidden before the mask of social pleasantness comes down. "We didn't. We weren't expecting you." "I thought I'd surprise you," I said. "Is this a bad time?" "We have some people over," Jennifer said, appearing behind him. She was wearing the kind of outfit that costs more than most people spend on clothing in a month. "We didn't know you were coming." "I mentioned wanting to visit," I said carefully. "You never confirmed anything," she said, and she was right. I hadn't confirmed anything. I'd just shown up, which was either a bold gesture of connection or the act of someone too desperate to see the signs that said I wasn't wanted. I was beginning to suspect it was the latter. "Well, come in," Michael said, but there was an edge to it, that particular tone of obligation masking irritation. The house was full of people I'd never met, colleagues of Michael's probably, business people. I stood in the living room with my suitcase still rolling beside me, looking at my children's friends, feeling the temperature of the room shift toward confusion about who I was and why I was there. "Why don't you get settled at a hotel?" Jennifer said after about 40 minutes of stiff conversation. "We're in the middle of something, and you must be tired from traveling." "I booked a hotel," I said, "for tomorrow night, I thought." "You should probably just head there now," Michael said. He was kindness by this point, the kind of kindness that's actually rejection polished until it shines. "We have an early morning tomorrow, and we didn't think we needed to. The guest room isn't prepared." The guest room. There were 5 bedrooms in that house. I'd seen them on the floor plan Michael had sent me years ago, back when he'd first bought it and wanted to show me what he'd accomplished. "Of course," I said, "I understand." "We'll do breakfast," Jennifer said. "Tomorrow, the 4 of us. How does 8 sound?" "8 is fine," I said. I was a 73-year-old man who traveled across the country to see his children, and I was being very carefully shown the shape of my unwelcome. But I was trying to make it easy for them. That's what you do when you realize someone doesn't want you. You make your absence as convenient as possible. I took another taxi to the hotel. I sat in a room that was identical to 1,000 other hotel rooms, and I opened the folder of information on the desk and looked at advertisements for places I would never go. And then I cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way you cry when you're by yourself and there's no one to perform for. At 7:55 a.m., I got up and went back to their house for breakfast. Jennifer made scrambled eggs. Michael made coffee. Emma, Michael's daughter, who was 22 and doing something important with artificial intelligence or computers, asked me questions about my job, my old job, the one I'd retired from 16 years ago. They were the kind of questions people asked to fill silence. Daniel, Jennifer's son, was at school. Emma and Daniel had the kind of lives that went on without me. They knew I existed, probably, the way you know that Greenland exists, as an actual place, but not somewhere you think about. "Dad, we've been wanting to talk to you about something," Michael said. This was after breakfast, after Emma had left for something with her friends. I knew what was coming. I could see it in the way they exchanged glances, the way they'd rehearsed this, the way the conversation had been carefully managed. "Your house in Portland," Jennifer said, "you still own it." I did own it. Not the house I'd sold, but the condo I downsized to. It was paid off, and it was mortgaged to me in the sense that every financial decision I made was determined by its continued ownership. "I do," I said. "Mom left you that money," Michael said. "The inheritance, and it was substantial, and we've talked and we want to help you transfer it to a more efficient situation." "Efficient," I repeated. "A managed fund," Jennifer said. "There are people who specialize in helping older adults with their finances, and your current arrangement, the condo, the pension, it's all a bit scattered. We want to consolidate it." "So that you can manage it," I said, not a question. "So that you're secure," Michael said, and he believed it, I could tell. He believed that what he was doing was kindness, that taking my remaining financial autonomy and consolidating it under their care was love. "No," I said. "Dad," Jennifer said, "you're 73, you're alone, you should have people looking after your interests." I said no, I repeated. Michael's face hardened. "This isn't something we're asking your permission for. We're trying to be reasonable, but if you won't cooperate, we'll move forward with a conservatorship." A conservatorship, which meant a judge. Which meant my children could effectively strip away any control I had over my own life. Which meant I would become a person to be managed rather than a person to live. "You can't do that," I said. "We can," Jennifer said, and her voice was soft, which made it worse. "We already consulted with an attorney. You're showing signs of poor judgment. The condo is in a questionable neighborhood. You're isolating yourself. You're not managing your health well. There's a pattern." There was a pattern. The pattern was that I was old, and I was alone, and I was a liability to them, and this was the kindest way they could think to handle it. I left the house. I didn't say goodbye. I took a taxi back to the hotel, and I booked the earliest flight home, and I sat in that airplane, and I felt something inside me snap like a branch under the weight of winter. They weren't bluffing. The lawyers started contacting me in February. The conservatorship petition was filed in March. I hired my own attorney, an exhausted woman in her 40s who explained to me that I might actually be in real legal danger here, that if the judge decided I was incompetent, I would lose the right to make decisions about my own life and my own money. "Do they have grounds?" I asked. She looked at me with something like pity. "That depends on the judge and how good their lawyer is, and they can afford a very good lawyer." So I hired the best lawyer I could afford, which was to say a competent one who wasn't as good as theirs. And I felt the machine of my children's intentions grinding toward me, and I had two choices. I could fight them in court, or I could disappear. I disappeared. The dark secret I've been hinting at, the thing that changed everything when it was revealed, was this. I had a sister. I had a sister I hadn't spoken to in 37 years. And I knew, because I'd looked her up once in 2015 when I was feeling particularly alone, that she lived in California and worked as a therapist and had never married and had no children. And I knew that she might not want to hear from me, but I also knew that I had nowhere else to go. Her name was Clara. We'd been close as children before I went to college, before I moved across the country, before I got married and built my life and forgot the person I'd been. We'd had a falling out around my wedding, something stupid about my bride, some comment Clara made that I took as a betrayal. I'd cut her off. 37 years of radio silence as a punishment for a moment of hurt pride from when I was 26 years old. I drove to California in my 2014 Honda Civic. I drove for 3 days, and I thought about not going through with it, about just disappearing in some other way, some more permanent way. But I also thought about the man in the grocery store, picking up grapes, and something in me held on to that moment like a rope. Clara still lived at the same address. I parked outside her house at 4 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and I sat in my car for 2 hours before I knocked on her door. She answered in a bathrobe. She was 71 years old, 7 years younger than me, and she looked tired. She looked at me, and I saw the moment of non-recognition, and then the moment of recognition, and then something complicated passed across her face. "Woody," she said. "I'm sorry," I said immediately. "I should have called, I should have." "Come in," she said, and she stepped aside. I came into her house, which was small and filled with books, and had the feeling of a life lived thoughtfully and alone. She made me tea, and I sat at her kitchen table, and I told her everything. I told her about Sarah, about Michael and Jennifer, about the conservatorship, about driving across the country in the night like I was running from something that was chasing me. She listened, she didn't interrupt, and when I was done, she said, "You need to stay here for a while." I stayed for 3 weeks. I slept in her guest room and I helped her around the house, and we talked in the way that siblings can talk when they've known each other since they were young, even if they've spent most of their lives apart. She was kind to me in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. Not the performed kindness of obligation, but the real kind, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything. But I couldn't stay indefinitely. I was a man with a legal problem, and staying in California meant I was ignoring it, which meant eventually it would catch up with me. Clara helped me with something harder. She helped me disappear. This is where the story becomes less about emotional truth and more about practical truth, which is sometimes more devastating than any feeling. She had a lawyer friend. Through that friend, I learned about some legal protections for older adults fleeing conservatorship petitions. I learned that I could transfer my assets in certain ways that would protect them from being seized. And then I did the thing I decided to do that morning with the photograph. I liquidated everything. The condo sold for $380,000. The investment accounts, the pension. I took the lump sum option, which cost me a significant amount in penalties, but left me with cash. I had approximately $550,000. I gave $200,000 to Clara, not as repayment, which would have insulted her, but as a trust that if something happened to me, she would give it to Emma and Daniel, my grandchildren. They would never know it came from me, but it was there. I wanted them to have something that wasn't dependent on their parents' goodwill. The remaining $350,000 I put in a series of accounts that were legally difficult to trace. Not criminal, nothing illegal about it, but obscure enough that my children's lawyers would have a very hard time accessing it. And then I became a ghost. That was in June 2022. I've been living in various small places since then, mostly in California, sometimes in Oregon. I work odd jobs for cash. I volunteer at a food bank. I have a routine that has nothing to do with the person I was and everything to do with the person I'd become. And I've been at peace in a way I haven't been since I was young. Until 2 months ago. I was at the library in Sacramento, using the free Wi-Fi like I often do, when I saw an email notification on the public computer. It wasn't from my children. It was from Emma, my granddaughter, the one I'd never really known, the one who was 24 now. The subject line said, "I need to talk to you about something." She'd found me. I have no idea how, but she'd found an email address I used sometimes. Through Google searches probably, through the kind of digital trail that exists whether you want it to or not. I opened it. "Hi Grandpa," it said. "I don't know if you remember me, I'm Emma. I'm sorry to contact you like this, but I need to tell you something and I think you should know. Last year, Mom and Uncle Michael had a huge fight about you, about the conservatorship, about what they did. My brother Daniel told Mom that what they were doing was predatory and illegal, that they were acting in bad faith and trying to steal your money. Mom didn't take it well. They've barely spoken since. But that's not the main thing I'm writing about. The main thing is that I just found out there's $200,000 in a trust with instructions to give it to me when I turn 25. Daniel has the same amount. It came from someone with your name. I know you disappeared, and I know you did it because of what my mom and uncle did. I wanted you to know that I know. And I wanted you to know that you're not as alone as you probably think you are. Some of us understand. Some of us remember what kindness looks like. If you ever want to respond, you can write me at this email. No pressure. Just wanted you to know you're not alone." I sat in the library for a long time after reading that email. And I cried, which made the librarian concerned, but I waved her off. The twist, if you can call it that, wasn't that my children suddenly realized what they'd done. They didn't. Michael and Jennifer went on with their lives, with his growing wealth and her charity galas, with the kind of existence where bad things happen to other people, not to them. The twist was that the man in the grocery store, picking up grapes, he'd shown me something. He'd shown me what it looked like to treat someone as human. And that moment, small and unimportant, had somehow traveled through time and space and become the thing that saved me, because it meant I knew what real kindness was. And when I was drowning, I was able to recognize it in the form of my sister's open door. And then, years later, that kindness showed up again, in the form of my granddaughter, who'd paid attention, who'd cared enough to find me, who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let someone know they're not forgotten. I'm writing this from a coffee shop in San Francisco. Clara died 2 months ago. Not suddenly, she had cancer, and she was ill for a long time and she went peacefully. But it was me and her in her last days. It was me holding her hand. And in her will, she left me her house, and she left a letter explaining what I'd done, asking that if anyone came looking for me, they'd be told I was loved. No one has come looking for me, but Emma and I write now, carefully, without my children knowing. She's going to use the money from the trust to start a nonprofit that helps older adults fight conservatorship abuse. She named it after Clara. She didn't ask my permission, and I'm glad she didn't, because the answer would have been complicated. I am 76 years old. I am alone, but not in the way I used to be. I have a house now that I didn't have to sell. I have a granddaughter who knows me. I have small moments that remind me what it feels like to be human. And I have a photograph from 1998 of a family that broke apart, and I still can't throw it away, not because I'm holding onto the past, but because I'm not. Because I can look at it now and feel sadness without being destroyed by it. Because I understand finally that that family was real, and it mattered, and it ended, and I lived through that and I'm still here. That's the story. That's what I've been carrying alone.